Good evening. Good evening. Hello. I think we're going to start. We're expecting possibly a few more people to come, but we're going to begin anyway. The subject of this evening, this talk, is connected to the upcoming Chag. We are looking forward to a Chag, the Chag of Shavuos next week, which falls after Shabbos on Sunday and Monday. And really, this Chag is a very important Chag. It's one of the three major festivals, one of the 3 foot festivals when the Jewish people, in the times of the temple, would ascend to Jerusalem. They would go to the temple. Now, maybe we are more familiar with the holiday of Pesach, Passover, and Sukkot, because they are longer. They last 7 days, 8 days, whereas Shavuot is really only 1 day. But that doesn't make it any less important or significant. The event that we commemorate with this festival is the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. The time when the Jewish people, our tradition tells us, when the Jewish people stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God revealed himself and gave us the 10 Commandments and gave to Moses all of the Torah, all of the written Torah, all of the oral Torah, and this is still the same Torah that we have today. Now this is the story, this is Jewish tradition, and this is the basis for how an observant Jew lives his life. He lives his life on the basis that we have a Torah, and that Torah was given, it was a divinely given gift from God. So that's very nice. But how do we know that really happened? Did it really happen? Have any of us ever asked ourselves? You know, we come to synagogue maybe, and someone speaks about this is the time we receive the Torah. Has anyone ever asked themselves, how do I know that? Prove it to me. So the goal for this evening is not to either prove or disprove. That's not the idea for this evening. If I could come along and prove without any question in 45 minutes that God gave the Jewish people the Torah on Mount Sinai 3,320 something years ago, and we could all just go home, it would be a little bit strange, wouldn't it? So what I would like to do is discuss some of the ideas and some of the proofs and some of the arguments that have been undertaken to discuss whether this earth-shattering event actually took place or didn't. And the ramifications, the consequences are enormous, whether it actually happened or if it didn't. It's what we would often describe as being the difference between history and legend. Yeah? You know what legend is? Legend in German? Yeah. So history is something we assume that happened, right? We know what happened 70 years ago in the Holocaust. Okay, there may be some people that deny it, right? But we know that there's no real basis to what they're saying. There are certain things that we know that happened, and there are other things that we are pretty sure that never happened. We can be pretty sure that never happened. There may be a nice story, it may be it may be an inspiring idea, but basically we can assume that it never happened. Where does the story of the giving of the Torah fit into this? Okay? Again, it's one of the principal beliefs of Judaism that God gave us this Torah. How do we know this? So, it's also worth saying there are many, many, many more angles than we're able to begin to discuss tonight. I'm not necessarily familiar with all the angles. I'd like to present 1 or 2 ideas to at least make us think about what the basis for this belief is, and through that also perhaps realize how unique Judaism is in its history, in its tradition, and how it is somewhat different in its basic theological understanding from other religions. Okay? So even if we are not completely convinced, and even if we do not fully know how to justify, we can at least say that the Jewish belief, the Jewish history, the Jewish tradition is different to that of other religions. So there was a fundamental work that was written about 900 years ago by a great rabbi of the name of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Judah Halevi. And the name of this book was the Kuzuri. I don't know if you've heard of this book. It's been translated into many, many languages. And as I say, it was written many, many years ago, 900 years ago, but he was dealing with the same problem. He was dealing with people, in this case non-Jews, who questioned, how do you know that this event happened? For him it wasn't 3,300 years ago, but it was still 2,400 years ago, so it was still a big question. And he got himself involved in a great debate. Many others have also, the Maimonides, the Rambam, also got involved with debates concerning this subject. But he wrote a whole book about it, and the book is written in the form of a dialogue between him and the king of this Turkish empire, the Khazars they're called. And I believe in the end these people actually turned and converted into Judaism. I'm not sure of the full story, but this is one of the classic works. This book, the Kuzuri, is one of the classic works that deals with the idea of the basis upon which Judaism is built. Okay? So I want to say it's an entire book. It's a book that I'm not very familiar with. I've seen parts of it. What I would like to share with you is the basic idea of how he tackles this problem. Okay? And although the book is somewhat complex and brings many, many proofs from many, many different areas, I think really it's fair to say that on a very, very simplistic level, it boils down to one question. And when he discusses with this king, this Kaiser, if you like, he says, let's put our cards on the table and let's agree to one thing. The Jewish people make a claim that the Almighty God, the creator of heaven and earth, appeared to the entire Jewish people. Between 2 and 3 million people were there. We know there were 600,000 men between the ages of 20 to 60, and therefore a calculation of those men outside of those ages, coupled with the females, the ladies were there, means that there were somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. They were all there to witness this event on Mount Sinai all those years ago. Okay, this is the claim. So he says, there are two possibilities. What are the two possibilities? It either happened or it didn't happen. Would anyone disagree with that statement? So far, so good. This event either happened or if it didn't happen. Maybe those of you who are of great faith will say, no, it happened, no question. But at least let's understand through the eyes of the Kuzuri, discussing with this king, that he said we have to consider these two possibilities. It either did happen or it didn't happen. He said, if the event took place, then everything, all the story and the tradition and everything we accept upon today is something we can accept because it actually took place. These events took place. God spoke to Moses. He appointed him as his prophet. The Jewish people were there to witness this event, and everything's fine. What about if it didn't take place? Let's consider the other half. Right? One thing we see from here is that great rabbis are prepared to discuss philosophical ideas with those who have doubts or those who argue with that. They're prepared to put their cards on the table to discuss in an open debate exactly what happened. He said, let's say it didn't happen. So what happened? If it did not occur, if this event did not take place 3,300 years ago, then what is this story that we have? What is this tradition that we have? That we have a tradition that we received from our fathers, and our fathers received from their fathers, and so on and so forth. All the way back to that time. We are saying that really it never happened, but nevertheless, we still have this story. So he says, where did it start? It must have started somewhere. At some point in time, assuming that this event never happened, then someone must have come along and invented the story. Correct? Must have happened, yeah? It either happened, and if it didn't happen, there's still a story. So how did this story begin? So let's imagine or put ourselves in the place of the person who's trying to convince a nation. It's interesting, we have to think, what is the nation then? If the Jewish people never came out of Egypt and they never were given the Torah, what makes the Jewish people? So much of what defines us as Jewish people is our history and where we come from. But let's put that to the side for 1 minute. So he's saying that it would therefore necessitate, it must be that someone came along and invented a story. And the people accepted the story. They accepted the story. This man, what did he come along and say? This man, this woman, this group of men, this army, whatever it was, probably one man, these things are normally started by an individual, tried to convince the people that something happened many years ago. And it's true. If you were those people in that generation, and someone came along to you and told you, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you something, and not only I want to tell you something that happened. Yeah? This is not something that happened to a group of tribesmen in Madagascar, or a group of people in Tibet. This happened to your family, your parents, your grandparents, a few generations before that. But this occurred, and they were there, and they witnessed it. He writes, what would happen if someone came along with such a story? There was an earth-shattering event. There was thunder, there was lightning, there was the sound of the shofar. People saw things that are not seen. They heard things that are not hearable, audible. They saw the sights, it says. They heard the sights and they saw the sounds. An incredible display of divine presence. And someone comes along and tells you, this is what happened. You didn't know about it until now, but I'm now going to tell you that it happened. He said, who would accept such a thing? What would you say in response to that? Someone came along, it wasn't me, someone else came along and says, I want to tell you a story. Yeah, I want to tell you a story about something that happened a long time ago. What would someone's reaction be? He would normally say, prove it. How do you know this story? Where do you get this story from? Or more likely, an even better question he would say is, if this really happened, how come none of us heard about this? You're telling me that there was a revelation of God, the Almighty God, the creator of heaven and earth, and he spoke to all the people, 3 million people, and it was just sort of forgotten. It was just forgotten, and in the passage of time, after a few generations, no one really talked about it anymore. And you're coming along and telling me something that has been wiped away from human memory, wiped away from the history of these people, and now you're coming to tell us again that it actually happened, and we are supposed to believe it. The Kuzuri says, no person would be able to accept such a story. It cannot just be invented, a story of such dramatic proportions. So again, this is the basis of what he's saying. He's saying either it happened, in which case we have the tradition as it is, or it did not happen. And if it did not happen, someone invented it, right? And if this person invented it, the people accepted it. Why would they accept such a story? Why would they accept such a story of such a dramatic proportions? And they accepted that it was forgotten, and now it's being told over to them and they should believe it. This is basically it's not doing justice at all to his argument, but this is perhaps the underlying theme. How can we prove whether something is true or not? How can we would say, verify a claim? Someone comes along and tells you something. How do we know if they're telling the truth or not? I want to tell you a story. There's a story of a Hasidic Rebbe. I don't know if this story is true, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of what we're trying to say. A Hasidic Rebbe, yeah? You know the Hasidic Rebbes? What happens when the Rebbe dies? There's a new Rebbe. Who is the Rebbe normally? Who normally takes over? Any ideas? When the Rebbe dies, there's another Rebbe. Normally his son. It's not almost always his son. Sometimes the Rebbe doesn't have children. Sometimes his son doesn't want to be a Rebbe. Yeah?
Sometimes daughter.
Sometimes what? Daughter? His daughter can often be married to the Rebbe. That's often the case. Yes. You know, you've heard of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. His father-in-law was the Rebbe. And he either didn't have sons, and then so his daughter married the Rebbe, and then he became the Rebbe. This is also very possible. But in this story, the Rebbe did have sons. And in this story, the sons were capable of becoming the new Rebbe. There was one problem. At the time when the Rebbe died, he never announced who he wanted to be his successor. He never said. And he had 3 sons. He had 3 sons, this Rebbe. And each of these sons had a certain unique quality about him. The first son's first and foremost, his quality was that he was the eldest. So normally speaking, if you're the eldest son, you have certain privileges, and that's a reason in itself for the eldest son to think, maybe I should be the Rebbe. Okay, that's the first possibility. That's the first son. The second son was very smart. He was a chacham. He was very, very wise. And he knew much more and he was much wiser than the others. Okay? So he felt that maybe he should become the new Rebbe. And the third son was the youngest, and he wasn't the wisest, but he was very, very charismatic. Charisma, yeah? He knew how to speak to the people. He had a heart for everyone. Everyone loved him. He felt, I should be the Rebbe. So who should be the Rebbe? Normally, as I said, he would say before he dies, I would like to appoint him as the Rebbe. Sometimes they will appoint two, one in New York and one in Jerusalem, I don't know what. Sometimes these things happen. But here there was only going to be one Rebbe, and all the brothers claimed that maybe they should be the Rebbe. One day, one of the brothers came along, and he said, I had a dream. I had a dream last night, and our father appeared to me in a dream. And you know what he said to me? Guess what he said to me? He said, I want you to be the new Rebbe. This is what he said to me in a dream. And he came to his brothers, and he told them what had happened to him. And he said, clear as day, clear as night, I was spoken to, I was approached by my father in the dream. Would the other two brothers accept this argument, yes or no? Would they say, on that basis you should become the Rebbe? Or would they not? What would they say? What would they say? What would the other two brothers say? He has an argument, no? He says, listen, did you have a dream? No. Can you prove that I didn't have a dream? No. So I have a claim, you have no claim, let me be the Rebbe. What would they say? No way. No way, you're not going to be the Rebbe. Why? What's their argument? If our father wanted you to be the Rebbe, then he would have told us. He wouldn't have told you. He would have told us. Right? The way to select someone who's going to be a leader or to be a prophet, the last person in the world, right, who you would think that God would speak to in order to tell him and communicate to him that he has been appointed as the prophet or his spokesman, would be the person himself. Because how is anyone going to believe him? Okay? So they said, you can't. There's no way we can take you seriously. Why? Because if our father wanted you to be the Rebbe, he would have appeared to us also in a dream. Okay? So maybe he did appear to them in a dream and they're denying it, but we assume that he didn't. He only appeared to the son. He only appeared to this one son, and this one son said, you have to believe me. So they didn't accept him. They didn't accept him as a Rebbe. This story is actually an analogy. You know what an analogy is? A parable. Who is the Rebbe? The Rebbe is God. And who are the three sons? They're the three prophets. So he approaches one prophet and he tells him, you are my prophet. And he goes and tells everyone else. They don't accept him. Why should we accept you to be the prophet? Yeah. This is something that probably makes sense. This idea that if God were to communicate with someone, to be his messenger, to be his prophet, then it would make sense that he would want to verify it. He would want to make this appointment public, so to speak. He would tell other people, maybe all the people, but certainly not the person himself. I want to tell you something. That I want to ask. How many people do we have on this planet? 7 billion? 7 billion and counting. 7 billion and counting. Could you guess how many people on this planet alive today live their lives based on the acceptance of a prophet that spoke only to them and to no one else? Or not always them. There's an exceptional... Yeah, go on.
1 billion?
Percentage. I want percentage.
2%.
2%?
Less. 2%.
Who knows about the main world religions? This is not a class to discuss other religions of the world. But basically Islam yeah, and Christianity, and many, many other of the thousands of the world's religions are all based on such a prophecy. You know there are elections coming up in the United States this year. There may be a new president. You know about this new president? Do you know what his religion is? He's a Mormon. You know where that started? A guy called Smith. I don't know the story. He got a message. He got a divine message. Okay, this guy's done quite well out of it. He's worth a good few billion. No, he's done well out of it. But the 1.5 billion Christians in the world who believe in that theology, over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and hundreds and hundreds of millions of other people. Apparently the figure I saw was 52% of the world's population. And if you think about all the people who don't believe in any religion and don't believe in God at all, it's a huge percentage of people who live their lives and are prepared to even give up their lives, as we've already seen, all based on the appointment of a prophet that was only revealed to him. Okay, if you don't believe me, look it up. I'm not here to prove or discuss, prove or even disprove any of the other religions. But we have to realize that the basis for this religion, each of these religions was a certain leap of faith that the followers took. Now, the fact that followers take a leap of faith does not mean that it is not true by definition. But according to what we've said, and this story, this analogy with the Rebbe and his sons, it makes it highly unlikely, again, that someone will be appointed by God to be a prophet to bring down his message into the world by only informing him and no one else. And half of the people on this planet Earth live their lives according to such a belief. The Jewish people do not. We do not believe that God came to Moses and Moses came to us. We'll come on to the Jewish claim in a minute. But before we do that, we're trying to discuss here, at this point, what it is to verify a claim. How do we know something is true or not? Okay? So if something was true, and we're seeking truth, we want to know what really happened, right? This is the whole idea. This is what the Kuzuri went out to argue. It happened, or it didn't happen. That's what it boils down to. So here we're saying, if we want something to be true, and we want to verify whether it really happened or not, it is somewhat unreasonable for the message to be passed down to someone directly and not to be told or communicated in a wide forum. Whether all the people of that nation need to be there or not is up for discussion. But I think we'd all agree if one person, or even if a few people, were communicated a message to spread to everyone else, yeah, and to say this is the true word of God, the obvious question, the obvious response of the people would be, why should I believe it? Why should I believe it? Why was I not told? With this, we'll move on to the Jewish claim. Okay? The Jewish claim is, as we've already said, is that there was a revelation, a national revelation that happened at Mount Sinai. And every Jew was present to witness this revelation. Okay? So we're not relying, Jewish tradition tells us that we're not relying on God speaking to anyone directly and then passing the message on to us. Originally, God revealed himself to everyone, and he appointed his prophet, whose name was Moshe, whose name was Moses, to be his prophet. Yeah. And then the tradition continued from there. Some actually questioned, said, fine, God appointed this prophet, yeah, and his name was Moshe, and everyone was there and they accepted it. Maybe Moshe, once he accepted this mantle, this position, maybe after that, the original revelation was over. Maybe he went and changed some details. These things are also dealt with. How it would have been virtually impossible for Moshe, after he had been appointed by God, yeah, to then change the mandate of what God did. And it would be difficult to imagine God choosing such a person to be his prophet, who he suspected would not be a loyal servant and a loyal transmitter of his message. Okay? That's a side point that has been dealt with. I think maybe we mentioned it here once. I'm not sure. Okay? But the national revelation included in it implied that Moses is my prophet, and he is going to receive the Torah, and then he will then communicate this to the Jewish people, and this will be an eternal covenant between me, God, and the Jewish people. This is the claim. This is the claim. Okay? If someone wants to decide that they want to follow a different path, and they want to listen to the prophecy that was passed down to the person themselves, they have every right to do that. There's a big difference, though, in Judaism. Because what do we say? We are just a few weeks, a month or so past Pesach, Passover. We sit around the table, and every father tells his son, this is what happened to us, this is what happened to my father, and this is what happened to our ancestors when we came out of Egypt. A critical part of telling over of the exodus from Egypt and the formation of the Jewish people, which actually culminates now, at the time of the giving of the Torah, is the idea that I heard it from my father and he heard it from his father. Often at a Seder on Passover, there'll be many generations of people. This idea of many, many people coming together of different generations, all forming this chain back to the time when the Jewish people came out of Egypt, and afterwards when we received the Torah. But this idea of the connection between father and son is the basis of everything we have. Mother and daughter. Okay, it's described as father and son, but it means being passed down from generation to generation. Let me ask you, if we were to discuss a prophecy that was given over to somebody, and that person and a certain people, a group of people, accepted that prophecy, accepted that prophet to be the messenger of God, what is forcing the son to accept the same thing that his father accepted? We're talking about a leap of faith, right? A person decides, I cannot say 100% that it happened, but I believe. I say it happened, yeah, and I'm going to go with that. That's very good. But can I expect my son to go with that? And if he's going to take a leap of faith, why should he take a leap in this direction? Why should he go with Muhammad? Maybe he should go with Mr. Smith or whatever his name is, or many others. Who's to say? If a person wants to have his own journey and choose for him what he feels is close to his heart, let everyone go in their own direction. There's nothing that's forcing the father to make the son believe, because he's saying, I believe based on a leap of faith. I cannot force you to believe on the same basis. You can believe or not believe, but you're not forced to leap the same way that I leapt. Okay? That's the idea here. Fine. So a person could ask, how could it be that all these religions became so huge and so popular? This is the power. This is the power of people. Sometimes there were things that were forced upon people, and things spread and they spread and they spread. And it was all originally based upon a certain leap, certain jump, and that is what created these religions, and they far outnumber us by many, many, many times. Yeah? Amazing. The Jewish people is what? 15 million people, and there are billions of people who believe in other faiths. Yet our faith is fundamentally different. Fundamentally different. Yeah? And if nothing else comes out from this evening, we should realize that the basis of our faith is not based on a leap of faith. It's based on an account that was passed down from generation to generation. I now want to discuss with you, we have to concentrate a little bit, I want to discuss with you two prophecies that we find in the Torah. And the two prophecies, two things that were predicted will happen in the future. There are many, many things that were predicted that will happen in the future, and if we have time, maybe we'll talk about them as well. But primarily, concerning this revelation at Sinai, there are two things that were said. If anyone wants to look it up, it's in Devarim, Deuteronomy, the last of the 5 books of Moses, in the 4th chapter. Okay, it's a very interesting chapter, and it talks about how God addresses the people, all the people shortly before he dies. He gives them a long monologue, a long speech, and he says that there are two things that are said there that act for prophecies for the future. It's when there's a prophecy made about something that will happen in the future. On the one hand, it is very powerful in the sense that it is telling people what will happen and predicting something will happen. On the other hand, it's a great risk. It's a tremendous risk. What happens if I tell you something will happen? Yeah, I tell you that I'm a prophet, and I tell you such and such will happen this year, or in the future, in 100 years, or in 1,000 years' time. I'm putting my entire reputation on the line by making such a prophecy. So we always have to realize what is the purpose of the Torah giving us prophecies. Maybe hidden within these prophecies is the idea to prove, to suggest that there is an eternal, a divine author to these things. So what are the two things that appear? There are two things that Moses says to the people. When describing that, when reminding them that they all stood at the foot of Mount Sinai when they received the Torah, he said to them two things. He says, has there ever been, or will there ever be, such a revelation of God revealing himself to a people on such a scale again? Basically what he's saying is nothing ever like this ever happened before, and nothing will ever happen like this again, such a revelation of this scale. That's the first thing. Okay? The prophecy says it will never happen. The second thing he says, we'll see. The second thing he says is as follows. Will there ever be a claim that such a thing happened? You know what a claim is? Will anyone ever say that such a thing happened? So there's two things that Moses said. We have to concentrate now. Two things that Moses said. One thing he said was, such a revelation will never happen again. We're not talking about the final redemption of the Jewish people. We're not talking about the Mashiach. We're talking about the prophecy that such a revelation where God reveals himself to an entire people will never happen again. It had never happened before and will never happen again. That's the first thing he says. The second thing he says is, it will not happen again, nor will any nation come along and claim that it happened. Okay? So which of these two is the greater prophecy? Which of these two things is greatest? That he announces it will never happen again, or that no one will even say that it happened again?
Second.
I thought you'd say that. That's why I asked. Simply, if we think about it, if such an event will happen, it may happen or it may not happen. If a nation comes along, a people comes along and says, you know what, Mr. Moses, it did happen. You said it didn't happen, I said it did. What would we say to him? What would we say to him? It says in your Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse, I'm not sure, I have to look it up, that such a thing will never happen again. I am now telling you that it did happen. When did it happen? It happened in the other side of the world 2,000 years ago. What would you say to him? Prove it. Who says you're telling the truth? Yeah? Who says you're telling the truth? Why should I believe you? So he hasn't disproven the prophecy. So that's one thing. It's very, very difficult to prove that such a thing happened. But what are we saying in the second prophecy? The second prophecy says, no one will ever come along and even claim that it happened. So this guy that we're just talking about, not only he can't prove it, we're saying he'll never come along in the first place. So that, as Nathaniel says, is the bigger prophecy. Yeah? It's a risky business. No one has claimed such a thing. And it's a risky business for someone to write. If this was not a God-written Torah, it's a very risky business for someone to write that such a thing will not only never happen, but will never even be claimed to happen. And one must also ask that if this is a divinely given document, Torah, then how can we be sure that no one will ever come and claim it? Rather, we have to say that the second claim is stronger. That's what one would think initially. But I want to suggest another way round, that it's not quite like that. We think that people believe everything, that if someone comes along and tells them a story, that they will believe everything. It doesn't really happen like that. People do not believe lies. If something is a falsehood, they generally will not believe it. Now, if someone comes along and says, such and such a thing happened to me, and God appeared to me, then what are our choices? Yes or no? As we've already discussed on the story with the Rebbe and his sons, it's unlikely, it's unreasonable, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's possible. It's possible that it happened, yeah? But if someone comes along and makes a claim that an entire nation saw such a thing, right, and you didn't know about it, and I'm going to now tell you now that it happened, people will not fall for that. They will not accept it. Okay? Meaning to say that if something is not a logical, rational possibility in any sense, and someone is being told a story that doesn't make any rational sense or logic, they're not going to accept it. Based on this, what can we say is the greater of the two prophecies? The prophecy that it will never happen, or the prophecy that it will never be claimed? If it will never happen, and people will never believe it, then of course it won't be claimed. Because who would want to claim something that would never be believed? So rather than what we said before, that it's an even greater level, a prophecy to say it will never even be claimed. Not only will never happen, but no one will even suggest it happened. If we accept that something of such a magnitude could never be created from nothing, right? A little bit like what the Kuzuri said. People are not going to accept a story that there was a national revelation to 3 million people and it was forgotten, and I'm now telling you it happened again, and just believe me. If we accept that someone would not believe that, then no one would make the claim. Yeah? No one would make the claim. So that it follows suit that it cannot happen. But there's one more point in here that's very interesting. Let's say this was concocted, this was planned. A certain person, a certain individual came up with this plan. And he was successful at convincing a whole entire nation that they were the subject of this tremendous revelation, even if they forgot it. Yeah? And he convinced them that it really happened. If he was successful at achieving such a goal, why would he write in his Torah, why would he write in this text that no one will ever claim it again? Anyone following? Why would he write that no one will ever claim it again? He has managed to convince people to believe such a claim, so why would he say no one else will do the same thing? So if you're going to say that it's divinely inspired, divinely written, and therefore it was given over to the Jewish people, and such a thing could never be convinced by anyone else, no one would ever be able to be sold such a story, then of course it won't be claimed. But if you're going to say that it was actually a human that wrote the story, why would he then go along and say, after convincing everyone that it happened, that also it would never have been heard of? Why? In the same way as he convinced people to believe the story, maybe someone else will come along in the future. So you see that it's highly unlikely that such a person, since it's unlikely that he will be able to create such a story, it would never be claimed. And if he was able to create such a story, why would he say that there was never such a claim in the future? Does that make sense? Okay. We have a little bit more time. There are other things that are not directly connected to the revelation of Mount Sinai that are often brought down as rules, laws that we find, not just laws, instances, events that happened that are recorded in the Torah that would seem very, very strange if they were to have been written by man. One of them is actually something we read yesterday on Shabbos, in the parasha, in the weekly reading, where we read about a mitzvah of Shemitah. There's such a thing called a sabbatical year. Okay? The Jewish people, while living in the land of Israel, have a specific mitzvah. And that is that every 7 years they are supposed to leave the land and not plant it. Completely leave it. Not sow the fields, not reap the fields. They're supposed to not be involved with agriculture at all. When does this happen? Every 7 years. And where does it happen? In the entire land of Israel. Okay? And we are told that we should not worry. Right? You have to remember, we're talking about when it wasn't long ago that most people were sustained from the ground. It was an agricultural society. Everything people ate came from their fields. The income they had was as a result of selling the produce from their field. If a person is told that he has to leave his land fallow, not do anything for it for a year, he'll think, how am I going to survive? What am I going to eat? What am I going to give my children? And it says, the Torah tells him that you don't have to worry. Because in the 6th year, you're going to have a bumper crop. You're going to have a lot of produce. It doesn't mean literally in terms of quantity, but it means even in terms of quality, meaning a little bit of food is going to go a long way, and God is going to look after you. He's It's going to look after you, and you won't have anything to worry about. Wouldn't it make more sense that if we want to leave the land fallow for a little bit, for a year, there's such a thing that soil has to be re-energized, we have to leave the land, it can't be any agricultural area cannot be overplanted, it makes sense that every so often, every 7 years, let's say, the land should be left fallow. But wouldn't it make more sense to take different areas of the country at different times? 1 year leave the north unplanted, the next year the west. No, the entire country, the entire Jewish people living on their land have to leave the land and not work their land for 12 whole months. It's a tremendous test. The person who would be making up this law is putting himself in a very, very risky situation. Why not find some other solution? You want to tell me to keep the land? You want to tell me that God will look after you? Find another solution. Stagger the Shemitah, the sabbatical, different parts of the year. And if it doesn't work out, and the Torah gives us a promise, tells us a promise, don't worry, you'll have plenty to eat. There'll be enough for you because there'll be a bumper crop. If it doesn't work out, what's this person going to look like? Remember, he's only human. What's he going to look like? Why is he putting himself in such a situation to make it such a risk? This is just one example, and there are many, many more. But there are other things that we see that are practical to us today, that we see how the Torah talks about the future of the Jewish people and the nature of the Jewish people that seems to defy all the natural characteristics of other nations. This is a whole class in itself. I don't know if maybe I said some of these things over before. I think maybe I did. But there are certain things that are predicted in the Torah that make no sense if we're describing an eternal nation. The Torah tells us that we're an eternal nation. Okay? So once I was in a class hearing about this eternal nation and said, look, and the teacher was saying, look, we're still here. That's a proof that we're an eternal nation, the fact that we still exist. And one of the people in the audience, I think he was sitting next to me, he said, that's very nice because we're here, so we can say that. And if we weren't here, we wouldn't be able to say that, and no one would know. Now that we're here, we can say it looks very good. But if the Jewish people didn't survive anymore, who's to say we're an eternal nation? But the fact is that we are here, and the Torah says that we will be around for as long as there is humanity, as long as the world is as we know it today. It also says that we will always be few in number. The Torah predicts, at the time when we receive the Torah, that we will always be few in number. When we received the Torah, we've already said that we were about 3 million people maximum. 210 years earlier, when Jacob went down to Egypt, we were how many people? How many souls went down to Egypt? 70. In this period of time, 210 years, 70 Jewish souls became over 2.5 million. We expanded in unimaginable proportions. And yet the Torah tells us you will always be few in number. The Jewish people today, we are not many more than we were then. The Chinese people, for example, that now number 1.3 billion or something like this in the world, about 500 years ago, maybe a little more, they weren't many more than the Jews. But their natural growth, a bit more, we have to go back maybe 800 years ago, whatever it was. Their natural growth completely developed into a country that was a huge proportion of the world, and yet the Jewish people still remain few in number. It also says that we'll be hated. Wherever we go, we will be hated. There's anti-Semitism that a person can find in all parts of the world. And it also tells us that we will be scattered, we will be a light unto the nations. We'll be a light unto the nations. We will be a nation that gives light, gives morality, gives ethics to the entire world. That is our job as the Jewish people. That's not the subject of the talk. What we want to discuss was the authenticity of the Torah. As we're preparing to receive the Torah, we are supposed to be truth-seeking Jews, and we want to know. We have to discuss, how do we know? On what basis can we say that we have support for the claim that the Torah was given to the Jewish people? I want to leave off with something, and I think it's very important to say this, and that my goal in speaking about this was not to come and try to prove or disprove. That is something that, as I say, is impossible to do in a short period of time. And even if it were possible, it would need many, many, many classes to discuss all the different aspects of this. But nevertheless, there is certain unique attributes to the Jewish people and to their claim that are completely unique amongst all the religions of the world. So before we even start, we have to realize that the Jewish people, we have a solid basis for our tradition that cannot be found anywhere else. That's one thing. The other thing is, these arguments do not convince anyone. The arguments, the theoretical arguments, the philosophical arguments may convince some people. It seemed to convince the people that the Kuzuri was discussing in his book. But ultimately, the greatest proof for the validity of the Torah and the eternal nation of the Jewish people is their role and how they act in this world, and how they act to a light unto the nations. In this same paragraph that I quoted before, Devarim 4, Deuteronomy 4, it also says right at the beginning there, he says that when you keep the mitzvot and when you follow my laws and my statutes, that will be to the other people of the world your wisdom and your understanding and your knowledge. That will be for them a sign to which they will say, who is this people? Who is this great people that God has chosen as his nation? Very, very interesting. None of the signs that God performed for us when we came out of Egypt, none of the claims that God revealed himself to us on Mount Sinai, which in fact we didn't mention, is the basis for many of these religions that we discussed before. The only point of dispute was there a later event that annulled the original revelation at Sinai. But all the main religions of the world, Islam and Christianity, agree that God appeared to Moses at Mount Sinai, to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, and appointed Moses to be his prophet. It's only that they said later things changed and there was a new covenant. That's something that's very, very important to know. It's not only us that's claiming this thing happened. But above all of these, so to speak, theological, historical proofs, the greatest proof of the existence of the Jewish people and the connection that we have with God is our wisdom, our morality, and our ethics. And the greatest way that a person can feel connected to it, to the Jewish people, and connected to God, is to immerse himself and to understand and to study the world, to ask himself these things, not to prove or to disprove, but to be exposed to that Judaism has to offer, and to that is the ultimate way that he can become connected and try to strengthen within himself his own Jewish belief.